Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jalen and today I'm doing my May reading wrap-up. I believe I read 9 books and it was a pretty solid month overall. Before we get into it, as always, I will share what I am drinking today. It is a beer from Modern Times, one of my favorite breweries. I think they're based out of Portland. Yeah, this one's called Silent Opera. It's cool can art. 4.5% by volume, but Vienna style lager. So let's give her a try. Ooh, delish. I guess that's what Vienna style means. It's like a darker style of lager, I'm guessing. But I really like it. It's kind of, feels a little bit heavier, but not too, doesn't feel like very boozy, but very full of flavor. I dig it. So yeah, if you like beer and you haven't had Modern Times before, definitely check them out. They have cool cans. And I don't think I've ever encountered a beer of theirs that I haven't liked. So the first book that I have for you is Anybody Home by Michael J. Seidlinger. This is a horror novel coming out in August 16th of 2022. And when I tell you, this book is absolutely fucking terrifying. One of my worst fears ever. It's all about home invasion. So if you've seen the movie The Strangers or the movie Funny Games, or even if you think about like the movie Scream and getting a call from someone and they invade your home and kill you, that's what's going on in this book. Essentially, we follow a second person narration, so you're put in the perspective of a home invader who is getting tips from a very seasoned invader, and he tells you how to basically execute the best possible home invasion. And so it doesn't let the reader kind of look away from what's going on. It puts you right in the place of the action and really engaging in how to commit the most effective performance of a home invasion for people to later watch. There's this sort of motif going on in this about the camera following you and recording it for audiences that enjoy watching these home invasions and murders. And so the whole book is kind of premised on you trying to be in the driver's seat of that sort of performance, to put on the most artful depiction of violence in whatever you're doing. And so this follows one in particular home invasion in which you unfortunately watch what happens. And so this book is incredibly violent, incredibly depraved and bleak. There's not much hope to be found in this book at all. So if you don't have a strong stomach, trigger warnings galore in this book. And so if you don't like that kind of stuff, I would stay away from it. And I myself, I hate home invasion, but I think it's something, I don't know, it's a little bit helpful for it to be in a novel form to hopefully tell yourself that this isn't real. But this book really makes me question people that I see around me, people that come to my door. I am now very nervous about it. It makes you really consider the depths of human depravity and what people are capable of doing and what secrets people might be hiding and what they want to do to you, which is really bleak to say, but that's what this is looking at. It's looking at what people, their true inner desires are and the depravity of humanity, and you see it unfold with one family and this group of invaders and what happens to them. Super fucked up, but it was very good. I really, really not enjoyed my time with it, but I couldn't put it down. It's really innovative, and I tend to find when I pick up like occasional horror, I tend to really like it, and this was one that I really, really adored, even though it's incredibly bleak. So warning going into it, but if that sounds good, if you like the movie The Strangers and you feel like you have a strong constitution to read about this sort of stuff, give it a try. Hello, Editing Jalen here. I just realized I didn't really talk about the core of this novel, aside from it being about like the psyche and the drive of home invaders to commit this as like a performance. This book is truly, I think, about what it means to be a watcher or a viewer of this content. Like if we watch a home invasion movie or we're reading this book and we don't put it down and we kind of know what's going to happen, what does that mean for us? Like we're also sort of complicit in a sense in the perpetuation of these sort of narrative, the sort of, I guess, glorification of violence. Why are we entertained by it? And it really asks that of the reader. One, as it puts you like in the shoes of a home invader and really thinking about like, is you consuming this content also making you complicit in this? It's a really interesting exploration of all of that I forgot to mention. But anyways, back to the video. Next, on a completely different note, I have Jonathan Franzen's How to Be Alone. This is his, I believe, first essay collection. I think this was published in the early 2000s, but has since been reprinted with another essay called Mr. Difficult in it. I absolutely adore Jonathan Franzen. I am a stanzan, as they say. I have currently read The Corrections and Crossroads by him, and I've seen pretty much unanimously online that those are his 2 best novels. And so I wanted to start reading other stuff by him and hopefully finding that I also love it similarly to how I love those 2 novels. I'm kind of nervous because like his first 2 books that he published, 2 novels, seem to be quite widely hated. But given how good his other 2 books are, I don't really understand how he can be that bad. I'm wondering if people are just giving him a bad rep for various reasons. He has a weird reputation online about being sort of like a disgruntled older guy. This essay collection doesn't really go into any of that. I know people kind of complain about his bird watching essays and certain of his opinions about things that I haven't really been able to pinpoint what exactly people don't like about him in particular, but all that to say, he has quite a reputation, but he's quite well known to be an incredible novelist, very successful novelist. And so I wanted to try out some nonfiction of his, and this was actually really, really good. I will say that I sometimes have a hard time with essay collections such as this, in which there's a thematic underpinning, but it's not really rooted in one like true core theme. It's quite a broad theme of like being alone and loneliness in the art of fiction as an answer to loneliness. He looks at a bunch of different topics here, including one about novels and literature and his position on it, one about like sex writing and literature, but he also has essays that are really personal. One is about his father's battle with Alzheimer's disease, and that was my favorite essay in this collection, hands down. And actually I did this on audio as well, and Jonathan Franzen actually read that essay, and it was really emotional, really moving, and just perfectly like crafted in how he kind of chronicles his relationship with his father. And it was interesting like hearing a personal aspect of Franzen and also seeing how that played into his creation of the Corrections, which was published in 2001, and how his relationship with his mom and his dad are really indicative of the two main characters in the Corrections. And so it was really fun to see those connections after having read the Corrections and loved it. So yeah, I really like this. I will say some of the essays didn't really stay with me as much as others. Like I said, it's hard to sometimes like you're not in the mood to read an essay about something. Like for example, one essay that I actually think is really good in here is about the Postal Service, but like unless you're like actively going out to read an essay about the Postal Service, like it's hard to just read a collection and like get to that and then be like, am I in the mood for this right now? I'm a very big mood reader, so those were kind of like some slight struggles I had with it, just like on a personal reading level. But aside from that, I thought this was great. So he's 3 for 3 for me so far. And I'm actually reading Freedom, his other novel that was published in I think 2010 this month with some friends of mine here on BookTube. So we'll see if that one stands up to the others, but really like him all around. He's a favorite writer of mine now. Excellent stuff. Next up, I have a newer release. It's called Little Rabbit by Alyssa Songsiridej. Last time I talked about this book, I meant to look up her last name and I haven't, so I apologize. But this is very much in the vein of the sort of, not even sad girl, like getting into a complicated relationship style novel. This book isn't really sad, which is interesting. I think if you've read books such as Acts of Desperation by Megan Nolan, or those sort of books, I'm trying to think of another one. Yeah, that's the main one I can think of. Like Acts of Desperation, a young woman getting involved with an older man. You sort of question the dynamics proposed. This narrator who meets a choreographer who is at an artist's residency in Maine. And the first time she meets him, it's like in the past, I think like over a year or two ago. They don't really get along, but then she has an opportunity to go see some of his performance art or choreography in another summer, and then she goes and they start to have a connection, which eventually grows into a very intense relationship. This book has certain like BDSM elements going on in it in the relationship as it kind of progresses, and the different perceptions that people have regarding her age and his age, considering that difference. But also this book is really interesting because this looks at friendship in intimacy and relationships, and how this woman, she's queer, she's bisexual, and she ends up getting involved with this cis heterosexual man. And her friend, who she's rooming with, is also queer, and she starts to question, like, why are you going with this guy when last time you dated a girl? So these sort of like messy questions about bisexuality and what that means. This book is really, really similar to me to Acts of Service by Lillian Fishman, which I've covered extensively on my channel, but this has a bit of a different take. It's not a throuple situation. It's more of this look at, one, this relationship that's quite intense and what it means for someone to try to find happiness in this. It's less like sad girl vibes and more like self-discovery vibes through intimacy. Sort of like Katie Kitamura vibes in a sense, if you've read her, kinda. But it's more like romancy but literary, about these kind of power imbalances in the relationship and her own perceptions of her sexuality and how that all plays out at the end of it, and also like the underpinning of art and choreography and how that all plays out as well. And these sort of like expectations that she has for herself that are playing against what's actually going on in this relationship, really fun to read about, and seeing her kind of discover like what is her agency versus what is not. Is this guy toxic or is he not? And she really feels that she loves him, and the messiness that ensues. So I would say like if you don't tend to like romance novels but you want to read about a love story that's quite like intense, it's a bit more like literary, I guess, I would try this one. It was really, really good and interesting. Lots of sex writing, steamy times, so that's in there too. But I think my favorite part was the explorations of queerness in this relationship, and like the friendship dynamic here was really original for me to read, at least. Next up, I read The Trouble with Happiness by Tove Ditlevsen, translated by Michael Favala Goldman. This is a new short story collection that was just translated in English from the Danish, and I had previously read the Copenhagen trilogy late last year, and I really enjoyed it. That trilogy is quite informative for this story collection. Essentially, that trilogy follows 3 different periods in Tove Ditlevsen's life. So it's very autofictional, bordering on like memoir from what I've seen. And it looks at her childhood, her youth, and her adulthood. They're called childhood, youth, and dependency, with the latter being about her adulthood and her battles with addiction and various toxic relationships. And so the book is very bleak at times. It becomes more bleak as the trilogy progresses. You see from like her childhood how she really wants to be a poet and wants to be a writer. And so it's cool like reading the work that she eventually created. Sort of talks about and like her aspirations in her memoir or the autofictional trilogy. This collection is very, very similar thematically to the very bleak, sad longing of domestic life. This book is a kind of like an indictment of marriage, of parenthood, of domesticity, given that they were written in Copenhagen in, I believe, the 60s, I want to say. Is that correct? I think the 50s and 60s. Interesting seeing how she tackles this from a third-person perspective. As I mentioned, the autofictional trilogy are first-person and very much interior, and Tove Ditlevsen, or the narrator in those books, thinking about her life. And this is looking at a bunch of different characters and different sort of like scene setting going on of like different families, different dynamics, and how Tove Ditlevsen tries to look at some aspect of loneliness or domesticity in each of these stories. So they're very, very bleak, and they do sort of blend together so well thematically that thinking back on this collection, like I can't really think of too many like individual stories. Like there's some I can't think of, like the one about the cat I remember very vividly, the one about the umbrella. I think when she uses a sort of like symbol in her stories, I think it's really helpful to kind of imprint it on your mind. But other ones that are more so about familial dynamics, the characters can kind of like become one and the same. But every single time I was reading a story, I really liked it, and it was really intriguing, and it was sort of sad thinking about how she sort of adapted her thoughts into a new format in the story collection. And they're quite brief, so it's easy to get through. It's a quite short collection, but overall I really like this as a companion to the Copenhagen trilogy. I think they both really inform each other quite well in an interesting way that I haven't really experienced before, like reading an autofictional memoir style piece that also is complemented in a very similar thematic tone by the same writer in a different form. It was really fun. So that's that. Next up, I have a memoir called Easy Beauty by Chloe Cooper Jones. This is a book that I've read for 2 reasons. One, my friend Hannah May on here, she really loved it. And then the publisher sent it to me, and then my local book club at my local bookstore picked this for the May pick. And so I read this one. I did it mostly on audio, on Scribd. It's on there, and it's read by Chloe Cooper Jones, and I really, really enjoyed it. To get into what this book is about, it follows Chloe Cooper Jones's life in a sense, but really it's her reflection on her conceptions of various philosophical thoughts. She has her PhD in philosophy, and this is sort of her exercise of thinking about certain philosophical ideas and putting her own life over them and seeing what she can kind of make out of it. She's also a travel writer, so a lot of this book is her traveling around the world, but also it's about her disability and navigating an ableist society, thinking about this conception of easy beauty versus difficult beauty in a disabled body, and how that's caused certain conflicts in her life, and how it plays on certain relationships, whether it be with her father or her mother, with her son, who she didn't think that she could even have given her disability, and how all that kind of plays in her own development. But a lot of this book is spent alone with Chloe as she travels the world and reflects upon these things. And so this book is not chronological. It's very much jumps around in time, in place, and really thinking about how Chloe thinks about herself through different settings, different relationships, and with her body, what it means to be human, how you affect other people, but also thinking about her own experience and how that all kind of plays together for her. And there's this one section in this book in which she thinks about her relationship with her father that really stood out to me so much. Her father was an alcoholic, and he cheated on her mom all the time. And there's this one reflection in which she's a child and she's with her dad at the grocery store or like a department store, and he sees a woman who he's attracted to, and he starts like following her around, and she seems into him. And Chloe, she's a young kid, I think she's like 10 or 12 or something, and he's following her around, and they have like a moment of embrace, I believe. And Chloe sort of like knows what's going on here, but it was interesting because she talks about later how her father was never like satisfied with his life. He always he stumbled into drinking or he stumbled into cheating in different relationships. And this is one point where she says that he felt very like offended by the mundanity of existence, whether he has to do the dishes or go to the grocery store, how he felt like so much of life is so mundane and useless, and like how do you find beauty in your life if not through not conforming to certain, like, I don't know, domesticity or just various day-to-day things of life that aren't as beautiful as others, and how we sought that in the wrong places, whether it be with alcohol or with cheating or what have you, or not paying attention to Chloe, of eschewing fatherhood overall, and how she sees herself in her father but also plays that off of like the various philosophical musings that she has. She quotes directly certain philosophers and presents their thoughts and philosophical frameworks to then think about her life. It's very sort of like not scatterbrained but all over the place, but it works really well. I think it's a sort of idea of easy beauty, whether thinking about a memoir, traditionally it's told from childhood to adulthood or death, and this is really thinking about difficult beauty, adding some difficulty to the form of a memoir and thinking about what it can really be and kind of opening up that sort of conversation, which I really like. So overall, really love this. She's not afraid to be unlikable or really put her true thoughts on the page, I guess, and I really like that. So I like the voice of this. It was great. Read it. Okay, next up I read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I was like, you know what, maybe I should just pick this up. It's a short book. It's been on my shelves forever. It sounds interesting. And I had seen a ton of like coverage of this book. Like I know Carolyn Hempsey really loves this book, and I sort of like intentionally avoided watching anything about it because I knew it was sort of like a mystery and could be spoiled if you knew too much. So I always kept it a little bit of a mystery. So I didn't really know much about this going into it. I did this one on audio as well, which I guess the audiobook won like the Audie Award for Best Audiobook like a year or two ago. But very simply, we follow this man who doesn't seem to know much about his identity or his past or anything. It's sort of giving trauma plot vibes, which I can't stop talking about on my channel. I'm sorry. We have a man who is in this labyrinth where it's very intricately explained. It's sort of 3 levels of a labyrinth with, I think, hundreds or thousands of doors and different wings of the labyrinth. Oh yeah, the rooms are infinite. Is that true? I don't know. Like the lower floors have certain waves. The middle floors are sort of normal, but sometimes the waves come up and cause chaos for Piranesi and the other, who is the other person in the labyrinth with him, who seems to be the only other person that lives in this labyrinth. The top floor is sort of like the sky and birds and everything. And so to start, this book is really following Piranesi, giving descriptions of his environment, trying to make sense of where he's living in. As a reader, you're sort of like, what is going on here? Like, what is this? Where is this going? And the other, who's the other person in this labyrinth, approaches him and tells him that there is certain like knowledge to be found, and sort of presents this adventure to figure out what did this knowledge holds. But as the novel progresses, I don't want to say too much more, Piranesi starts to learn that something is not quite right with the other and what's going on in this labyrinth. And from there, this book kind of explodes into a mystery of what is Piranesi, why is he in this labyrinth, what is the truth behind what's going on in this labyrinth, and all of that. I will say that this book, I'm feeling kind of mixed on it. I liked the reading experience for the most part. For some reason, I don't know if y'all will agree with me, but I feel like the labyrinth setup was a little bit too complex for its own good. This book is told in a bunch of different journal entries from Piranesi, and every single one he introduces it as an entry, and so every single time it's a new entry, which is like every other page or every page for the most part, he gives like a title of what's going on, and then he says entry for the 31st day of the 5th month in the year the albatross came to the southwestern halls. And that's set up that way because it's his calendar system, but also like the hall setup and the way that it's described geographically is sort of like annoying for me to read at times. It's a little bit too convoluted, I think, or complex, but it didn't really like need to be as complex as it was. The ideas regarding what the reality is of the situation and Piranesi as a character and the discoveries that he has later in the novel are way more interesting. And I feel like there could have been a way that she framed this that was a little bit more simplified. I don't know, this book feels a little bit too like overwrought in my opinion. But I did like the revelations that came. I thought it was really well plotted. I do think from like an objective standpoint, it's kind of wild how Susanna Clarke did this in this novel. Very like ambitious in terms of its telling, in terms of how much she's putting into this novel while it's quite short and what she gets out of it. I know that her first book is like a tome of a novel, I think like 1,000 pages or something, but it was fun to sort of read something out of my comfort zone that was more fantasy, and overall I liked where the story went, but I didn't completely love my experience reading this book, so I feel kind of just like mixed on it, but I'm glad I read it. Okay, next up, I read the Pulitzer Prize winner this year. It is Joshua Cohen's The Netanyahus, an account of a minor and ultimately even negligible episode in the history of a very famous family. So this follows a fictionalized Harold Bloom. In this novel, he's called Reuben Bloom. This is set in the late 50s, early 60s in winter, and he is a Jewish historian. So not a historian of Judaism or Jewish history, but about America or American history, and he happens to be Jewish. And he is put on this board to decide whether to hire Ben Zion Netanyahu, who, if you are more familiar than I was approaching this book, was the father of Benjamin Netanyahu. And so this book is this sort of blend of like fictionalizing a famous scholar while also fictionalizing a story that Harold Bloom told Joshua Cohen about a stay the Netanyahus had at Harold Bloom's house, and how Joshua Cohen used that to sort of create this slapstick comedy of sorts. It's also this exploration of Jewish history and this idea of the diaspora, and how those two things sort of play together in terms of Reuben Bloom deciding or participating in the hiring committee for him. I will say this book is an absolute blast to read. It's this true like blend of comedy and like disaster in terms of the slapstick elements of what's going on here. I did this on audio, and it's kind of funny. I've never really listened to an audiobook that has music that plays at certain points. So like at the beginning of every chapter, there's like certain music that plays. It sort of reminded me of like Curb Your Enthusiasm, which I recently started watching with my partner, who is also Jewish. I really loved the family drama aspects of this when the Netanyahus come to stay at Reuben Bloom's house. All that plays out is bonkers and very funny. Going into this, I didn't really know too much about Jewish history generally. A lot of this book is at once this look at Jewish history and the diaspora and what that all means, and I just admittedly don't have that much historical context to understand the full nuance of what Joshua Cohen was trying to do with this, while also being a sort of teaching about Jewish history and what he's trying to say about or Jewish American identity in this book, that he combines with the comedy here that I didn't fully know how to think about critically just because I didn't have any sort of context for it. That does not discount the reading experience that I had of this book. I really, really enjoyed it. It's incredibly written. I think it's a really interesting use of comedy in this sort of like historical, very critical, satirical novel that I don't really read too much of. And so I would like to read more stuff like this, but I do need, I think, to take more time to do some research about the time period and what are the ideas addressed in the novel. Would probably help me get a better understanding of what Joshua Cohen's doing with the conceit here. But aside from that, it was really fun to read. So that's what a good novel does, I think. Alrighty, 2 more books. I have Cult Classic by Sloane Crosley, which is out, I think, when you're watching this today, June 7th. This is a really interesting book for me personally because it's a bit of like a rom-com, but it's quite literary, which I appreciated. This book is about this woman who I think is in her early 30s. Her name is Lola, and she's newly engaged, and she is a bit of a mess romantically. She's had many exes, and she kind of uses this romance as a structure for her life, trying to find happiness through love and monogamy, and the sort of failure that's had for her. She also has a history of working for this psychology magazine, and she's still sort of related to her ex-boss, who is important in this novel. And one night she's at dinner, and then she goes out to buy cigarettes, I believe, and then she runs into an ex, and she's like, that's weird. And then she keeps running into exes from her life, and she's like, what is going on? This can't be a coincidence that I ran into my exes. Like, what is happening? Eventually, she learns that there's some sort of cult that is at play trying to get her exes in proximity to her for some reason that you have to read the book to find out. But I thought it was really fun. It was interesting reading like a sort of plotty novel about the cult of romance and monogamy and sort of like indicting it, but also thinking about like how can one successfully still achieve happiness through a relationship. So like the key conflict here is whether Lola's going to stay with her fiance, and so we get some more about him while she also runs into her exes and thinks about like, did I make the wrong choice? Did I make the right choice? While also having this weird cult that's kind of funny and how it's presented play with the reality that she is experiencing, and thinking about like those kind of macro ideas of cult of romance and the cult kind of playing with her. It's not completely believable, I would say, but I think it's still fun to kind of suspend your disbelief and think about these ideas of romance in a way that is quite brainy. And like the narration here is quite quippy. Lola's a really fun narrator to read, and Sloane Crosley clearly is very smart in thinking about these topics. And so it's like a breath of fresh air reading a book like this. And I just loved the sort of blend of like plot with hilarity, also being critical and analytical of romance generally. Check it out if you want something that's perfect for like summer and all about New York. If you want like a New York novel, this is very much rooted in New York City and a kind of a love letter to the city. So that was a fun one. And last but not least, I have a book that I'm very intrigued to talk about right now because, so it's Trust by Hernan Diaz, and I actually did an individual book review of this book. And in that review, I had just finished reading it that morning. I think I filmed on my lunch break the review because I was like, I need to talk about this book. And I mentioned that it might be my favorite book of the year. Essentially, I have the full review there, so if you want to hear more about it, I do think that this book is probably best if you go into it blind, but at the same time, I'm a booktuber, so I want to sell the book to you so you want to go pick it up. Essentially, this is a look at money and power and storytelling set mostly within the 1920s following this very rich and famous couple that makes their money from Wall Street. So to start, we have a novel within the novel that is the first of 4 parts in this book. And in that novel, it is a fictionalization of a certain couple that we later learn about the truth behind them, in a sense. And it follows their sort of growth as a couple and how they earn their money on Wall Street and the very kind of fraught relationship that they have to each other, but also the kind of weird, reclusive aspects of their identities. And eventually the novel kind of comes to a head with certain realizations about the wife and a certain mental illness that she suffers from and how that all plays out with the backdrop of like power and fortune and money being this sort of fictitious entity that Benjamin Rask in the novel, he really seems to be drawn to for reasons that aren't very clear. He seems very much in it for the sort of game of it. He doesn't have much like a personality, it seems, and so he seems very much purely driven by the goal of making money, but it's not really clear like why he's that way. And then the next 3 parts of the novel sort of question what the novel within the novel is doing or saying about this couple. And so there's so many realizations in here. Every single part makes you question what you just read, which I loved the reading experience of having different parts make you think about what fiction can do, how with what you're presented with first, which is the novel, how it sort of skews your perception of the quote-unquote real characters within the rest of the novel, and how those ideas play together while being this truly sort of remarkable commentary, in my opinion, on the art of fiction, while also being about the artifice of fiction and also that of money and power and the cyclical nature of those things. Capitalism, in a sense, and money and the power and corruption that kind of comes with those things, while looking at this one couple and the various realizations that you learn throughout the rest of the book. I feel like I just summarized that terribly, and I feel like I did a better job in my review. So if you want a better description, that is there. I think this book, I picked it up and I could not put it down. It is a quite long novel. I think it's like 400 pages. Yeah. I think when you pick this book up, you won't want to put it down, knowing that the other 3 parts to come will make you question everything that you've read. And I think that's such a fun reading experience in a novel that I hadn't really experienced before. So that is Trust. Loved it. So good, so smart, very well written, and just interesting and fun to read. So that's that. Anyways, that is my May wrap up for you. If you've read any of these books, please let me know. I would love to know your thoughts on them. If I persuaded you to pick any of these up, I hope you enjoy it as well. I'm currently in the pits of my June TBR. I'm actually kind of sticking to the TBR that I made in my last video, and I'm really enjoying like everything that I'm reading right now, which is really fun to experience. A lot of different things, a lot of queer shit, and so that'll be coming next month, and I'm very excited to see how many actually get to. But anyways, I will leave it there, and I will catch you all in the next one. Cheers.